Today's lectionary passage comes from Isaiah chapter 25, verses 1 through 9. Hear the word of the Lord. O Yahweh, you are my God. I will extol you, I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things, plans formed of old, faithful and sure. For you have made the city a heap, the fortified city a ruin. The palace of aliens is a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore, strong peoples will glorify you. Cities of ruthless nations will fear you. For you have been a refuge to the poor, a refuge to the needy in their distress, a shelter from the rainstorm and a shade from the heat. When the blast of the ruthless was like a winter's rainstorm, the noise of aliens like heat in a dry place, you subdued the heat with a shade of clouds. The song of the ruthless was stilled. On this mountain, Yahweh of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wine strained clear. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Then Yahweh God will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of the peoples he will take away from all the earth, for Yahweh has spoken. It will be said on that day, Lo, this is our God. We have waited for him so that he might save us. This is Yahweh for whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. We like life to follow expected routines and norms. It is the stuff that prejudice is based upon, the basic prejudices that allow us to function in life. Things that we can expect, we know to be certain. And so we build our lives upon the basis of those expectations. And likewise, we rebel strongly when those prejudices, those expectations are challenged. We want life to follow stated, specific rules, to abide by certain guidelines, where we know how to plan for the future. We understand what causes certain things to transpire. And we know then how to navigate the uncertainties of life because of those things that we can hold to fast, to cling to, that offer us safety and refuge. But what do we do when God's way of doing things comes in conflict with our expectations, with our prejudices, our prejudgments of how life operates, of how the world functions, of how God would call us forward? Reversals seem to be a standard in the Yahwist faith tradition. The narratives that tell of the faith in Yahweh are filled with reversal after reversal, the unexpected coming after another unexpected adventure in the journey of faith where one is called and bound to trust Yahweh into the uncertainty of the future that lay ahead. We hear the story of a burning bush that is not consumed. We hear of a people enslaved to the world's superpower, walking out, despoiling the Egyptians without ever entering into the first battle. We see Yahweh lead them unexpectedly through the sea of reeds. We see water spring from a rock to give them something to drink in an arid land. We see manna fall from the sky to fill their needs, one and all, without distinction. We read of the reversal of the story of Jericho and how walls tumbled down without the use of siege ramps, but simply by marching around the city, blowing trumpets and allowing God to intervene. We read the story of Gideon and his 300 who, by holding up torches and blowing trumpets, rout 130,000 enemies. Repeatedly, stories that proclaim the marvels of God's reversal on our expectations of life, ushering in redemption and salvation, that the nation as a whole might bask in God's provision, God's protection, God's grace for all people. And yet that word comes consistently, interrupting the expectations of the people as they settled into the routines, the structures, the established patterns for life in Israel. As they looked around to the way the nations bordering them carried about their lives. And Israel consistently departed from God's norms. We find that every time God intervened, it was through some unexpected means. God came in doing the impossible to allow for redemption, to provide for his people in unexpected ways, time after time after time. And so when we hear Isaiah's words in chapter 25, we know that the people are accustomed to hearing of God's salvation coming unexpectedly in unimagined ways, as God steps in to turn everything upside down from our expectations. We find in Isaiah's words two competing images. The first, which comes prior to today's passage, sets up the expectation that because the people had failed to live up to God's demands for justice, they would be taken into captivity, marched away to Assyria, dispersed among the nations. But that would not be the final note in God's plan and design for the future. Indeed, these words we read today are words about hope and redemption on the other side of deportation, on the other side of exile and doom. God would turn the world once more upside down, and the people would experience once again an exodus from bondage, slavery, captivity. They would be returned once again to the land of promise. But this time, upon their return, things would look different. Isaiah paints a portrait for us of life turned upside down. He begins describing the powerful enemies of Israel being looted of power, cities laid ruin, the powerful armies set aside as nothing before the presence of Almighty Yahweh. We find the people ushered back into the land promised to Abraham, and they're experiencing the great reversal of Yahweh's redemption and provision. Isaiah draws a picture for us of God's banquet in the land of Yahweh, open not simply to Israel, not just to Judah, not simply to the immediate descendants of Abraham through the 12 tribes. He says provision made for all peoples, all nations, where everyone would have ample, equal access to Yahweh's provision for their needs, without discrimination. Wine in ancient Israel was a symbol of joy. It was a symbol of receiving the full benefits of Yahweh's promise. The people had left Egypt, wandered in the wilderness, but were ushered into a land where they had the opportunity to plant their vineyards, to harvest the crops, to press the grapes, and to ferment the wine. By the time that wine was ready to be enjoyed, it would mean that they were settled in the land, were comfortable, were safe from the encroachment of enemies, and could rest in Yahweh's provision. The land was to be divided among all peoples equally, all families having their fair stake in the benefits of Yahweh's production. But in Isaiah's vision, these benefits extend beyond what Israel had ever managed to accomplish along these lines. He says that Yahweh's banquet, rich food, and finely aged wines, strained to perfection, would be made readily available to all people without distinction. It may be difficult for us at times to grasp the ins and outs of what life was like in a subsistence agricultural economy like that of ancient Israel. But wine, and fine wine especially, was reserved for those of the powerful elite. There was no middle class to speak of in ancient Israel. The standard was to have a few wealthy individuals and many scraping by for a meager subsistence. Yet the vision that Isaiah portrays here is this fine wine normally available only to the wealthiest of the wealthy is here provided and available to everyone on an equal basis with no distinction. Yahweh providing for one and all on an equal par. It is the declaration of the full humanity, the full dignity and worth of every member of the society. And in Isaiah's words, extending beyond Israel itself, welcoming all nations to the same table. Ancient Israel was a wealthy enough nation in its own right. But that wealth did not extend to meet the needs of one and all. But in Yahweh's reversal that Isaiah so eloquently describes, He speaks of bringing the people back from captivity and honoring those left behind, stepped on, oppressed, and neglected by societies the world over. We find Yahweh inviting the widow, the orphan, the poor, the neglected, those distressed and stressed by their limited role in the provisions supplied by their social, economic, and political structures. This reversal of Yahweh's would be akin to that which Yahweh had first embarked upon when taking the people out of bondage in Egypt, where they would enter the land of promise and equally share in the bounty of Yahweh's land. This kind of reversal, this kind of equality, this kind of grace and mercy shown to all, beyond our definitions of worth, dignity, and merit, is something that we rebel against. It's not the world as we know it. It's not the systems of justice with which we are accustomed. It's not the way the world works according to our prejudices and received traditions. Yet the redemption of Yahweh is first and foremost a reversal of the world structures of which we are too much an integral part. This reversal aims to meet one and all at their point of need, lavishing upon those crying out in want, not the meager essentials for survival, but the finest fare available, given freely, without constraint, that we might enjoy the full bounty, the full blessings of Yahweh, absent the inequalities of so much injustice that we take for granted. When God challenges us to live by God's designs for justice, mercy, love, compassion, and grace, will we continue to rebel as was the norm for Israel? Or will we embrace this new model, this vision that Isaiah casts for us, in which God's provision is unlimited, embracing one and all without distinction? Aged fine wine for everyone, without distinction.